It's a contaminant that exists virtually everywhere. Now, not to mention, there are people that are using it in their front yards. Consumers are buying Roundup and spraying all over their front yards, their garden beds, their flowers. All of that causes runoff during the rain that contaminates the water system. So it's in everything.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
I'm your host, Hilda Labrada Gore. This is episode 133, and my guest is Kiran Krishnan. Kiran has been on the show a bunch of times, and there's a reason he's a favorite of ours. Kiran is a research microbiologist whose focus is the human microbiome and our wellness. He studied molecular medicine and microbiology at the University of Iowa, and he continues to be a leader in the field of gut health. Today, we talk to him about the herbicide glyphosate. Kiran explains the history of its usage, the science behind it, and why it's found practically everywhere, and how it acts like the worst kind of antibiotic when it enters our bodies. But he doesn't leave us there. We also discuss specific steps we can take to protect ourselves from its damaging effects. Before we begin the conversation, we want to recognize our sponsors. This episode of the Wise Traditions Podcast is supported in part by Just Thrive Probiotic and Antioxidant, the probiotic everyone's talking about. Go to thriveprobiotic.com. And Chelsea Green Publishing. Chelsea Green has been cultivating change since 1984, now an employee-owned company. Learn more at chelseagreen.com. Hey, and a quick note to let you know that the Wise Traditions Conference is coming up in Baltimore this November. You'll get to hear from all kinds of experts, including our guest today, Kiran Krishnan. Register at wisetraditions.org. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Kiran.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's so great to be back with you.
Well, I really wanted to talk to you today about glyphosate because I eat organic and try to eat really clean, and a lot of our listeners do as well. Does that mean we're minimizing our exposure to glyphosate?
We assumed that previously over the last few years, we assumed that, we just go organic, we go non-GMO, and we should be good to go. But as it turns out, a recent study has shown that organic foods typically have just as much glyphosate in them as non-organic foods. And so it becomes extremely hard to get away from it. Babies are being born where they find glyphosate in the umbilical cords. It's contaminating the water system because of the runoff from agricultural farms that use it. And the soil, the half-life of it in the soil is into decades. So even if the organic farm is now a farm that used to use glyphosate 10 years ago, it's still present in the soil. It seems that we really can't get away from it. It's also in the air. Once it gets into the fruits and vegetables, you can't get it off by washing it because it actually enters the cell structure. So you are inevitably consuming it, even if you wash and clean everything. So people used to think, let's go organic, let's go non-GMO, let's soak all our fruits and vegetables in apple cider vinegar and we're cleaning it off. And so we're good. As it turns out, we're not. We're still getting almost the same level of exposure as eating wheat that has been doused with glyphosate.
Which I know they use as a desiccant. In other words, to get the wheat more dry and prepared for turning it into flour or whatnot, they spray it again. But I've got to pick my jaw up off the floor just now in response to everything you've been saying. It's really shocking. Let's back up for just a second, though, and talk about why is glyphosate so damaging and why is it so omnipresent?
It's omnipresent because it is the number one herbicide used in the U.S. and globally as well. But in the U.S., there's higher levels of use of it here than in many other countries across the board. It's a generalized herbicide, so it's used on numerous different types of crops. The most heavily used crop is on wheat. But the other part that you mentioned is the desiccant use. If people don't know what that means, a desiccant is something that dries things, it sucks in moisture. And so before harvesting, they basically soak crops in this chemical in order to dry it out so that they can improve the efficiency of the harvesting. Now, here's a problem with that is, on wheat, we know they spray glyphosate as an herbicide because they have Roundup ready GMO wheat. However, we didn't know that on oatmeal, for example, on oats, they actually use glyphosate as a desiccant. They don't use it as an herbicide. So we assume that, okay, it must be fine because they're not spraying glyphosate as an herbicide on oats. But as it turns out, prior to the harvesting of oats, they used glyphosate as a desiccant. So they're soaking oats in it in order to harvest oats that end up becoming oatmeal. So, you might say, okay, I'm going to forego my cereal in the morning, the wheat based cereal, because I'm not eating wheat anymore. I don't want glyphosate exposure, but I am going to eat this good steel cut oatmeal. Well, as it turns out, that steel cut oatmeal probably has just as much glyphosate on it. You could be growing a glyphosate heavy agricultural wheat product at this farm, and then another farm, 10 miles on the road, they're growing organic, barley. But because of the proximity and the runoff from the glyphosate farm, the wind blowing it because it's sprayed on, so it's carried on the wind. And of course, the soil that they're using at the organic farm used to probably be a farm that was using glyphosate previously. And the half-life of it is quite long in the soil. So if it's in the soil, it doesn't get broken down very quickly. It can take years. So it's a contaminant that exists virtually everywhere. Now, not to mention, there are people that are using it in their front yards. Consumers are buying Roundup and spraying all over their front yards, their garden beds, their flowers. All of that causes runoff during the rain that contaminates the water system. So it's in everything. We're basically coming to the understanding that it is virtually impossible to get away from it.
So it's everywhere. Why should we care?
So that's a really important question, because when you look at what the FDA says, when you look at what Monsanto and those kind of companies that produce and supply these kind of chemicals say, they say it's perfectly safe for humans. They have tested it in human cells and it doesn't cause a disruption in human cells, so it's absolutely safe for humans. So that's the regulatory standing on this glyphosate. And then you would think, well, how would the FDA approve anything that's actually harmful to us? Well, we have to keep in mind that these things were approved back in the 70s, right? Back in the 70s and 80s, where our understanding of how the human body functions was completely minuscule compared to our understanding today, especially when it comes to the role of the microbiome in our health and wellness. So glyphosate is a compound that affects something called the shikimate pathway. So this is a biochemical pathway that certain types of cells have, and the purpose of the pathway is to make really important life-giving aromatic amino acids. So it's a particular type of amino acids which are the building blocks of proteins, and this biochemical pathway produces those. Now, plants utilize the shikimate pathway, especially lower order plants like weeds and things like that. So they use the shikimate pathway. And the idea is that if you spray this chemical on it, it interrupts the pathway. The plant can't conduct its necessary biochemical reactions, so then it kills off the plant. As it turns out, bacteria utilize this pathway as well. So when you test a human cell, the human cell doesn't utilize this pathway. So that's how they showed that, it's fine for humans to be exposed to it. Well, that's because when you test a human cell, there's no negative effect. When you test bacteria, which is our microbiome, there is significant amount of disruption because bacteria also use this pathway. Now, here's the crazy part about it, is that because of the way it works to interfere with this aromatic synthesis pathway, it actually selectively kills good bacteria and allows for the growth of a significant number of bad bacteria. So it's actually the worst kind of antibiotics. We all know that taking antibiotics can be really bad for your microbiome, can have long-term effects on your immune system and your overall health. And that's because antibiotics wipe down basically all bacteria in your gut.
Right.
It's like an atom bomb for your gut, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the glyphosate has a certain type of functionality where it specifically kills off good bacteria and allows bad bacteria like Clostridia, Klebsiella, Salmonella, Pseudomonas, these type of pathogenic, problematic bacteria to grow. So not only are we getting a daily significant exposure to an antibiotic. And in fact, if you look at Monsanto's patents from the 1970s, they filed a patent where they claim glyphosate to be an antibiotic. So it is an antibiotic, but not only is it an antibiotic, it's the worst kind of antibiotic that selectively kills good bacteria.
That is so wild. You're right. My listening audience is all about avoiding antibiotics, or at least knowing that they have this consequence in the gut. But who knew that glyphosate operated in much the same way?
In much the same way, and then a significant twist, yeah. The significant twist being allowing and actually creating a selection pressure for bad bacteria to flourish. And the bad bacteria that it allows to flourish are the worst kind, like Clostridia. We all know that C. diff infections are a massive problem. We know that overgrowth of certain types of Clostridia are associated with cognitive decline, with autism spectrum disorders. We know that the presence of glyphosate dramatically increases the risk for gut infections. There's actually some really, really great data graphs that are produced by the USDA themselves that plot the increased use of GMO corn and soy and glyphosate, along with the increased prevalence rate of a certain number of diseases. Some of the ones that they show a very, very direct correlative use of glyphosate with increase in the diseases are gut infections, autism, Alzheimer's, Parkinsons, autoimmune disease, diabetes, obesity. All of these things increase in direct proportion to the increased use of this chemical on people's food.
And these are their own stats. These are their own studies that seem to be pointing to this correlation. How is it they're not revisiting their regulations and the standards for which they say it's safe for humans?
That's the part that's really amazing to me. That shows you the political influence in regulatory space. The FDA and the regulatory agencies, their focus is not 100% on the safety of consumers. It is in large part influenced by big business. This is a $60+ billion valued company, and they have a significant amount of influence. I mean, the World Health Organization had declared glyphosate to be a possible carcinogen, or likely carcinogen, I believe is the terminology they use. So imagine the World Health Organization, the authority on scientific knowledge in the world, has declared this compound to be a cancer-causing compound. And that cancer-causing compound is still approved for use on all of our food. It's really mind-boggling to think that these things just don't change. A lot of it is because it was grandfathered in. It was safety profile was established with really not very good and not thorough science about 40 years ago. So they grandfathered in.
Coming up, Kiran tells us why we should still buy organic food and how we can vote with our wallets to help reduce glyphosate usage in this country. Also, we'll learn what we can do to protect ourselves from this ubiquitous toxin. We pause now to recognize our sponsors. Just Thrive Probiotic and Antioxidant. Most probiotic pills just pass through our bodies without achieving the desired effect. Just Thrive is the first 100% spore-forming probiotic that arrives alive in the intestines naturally. It supports optimal gut health, digestive health, immune health, and it delivers antioxidants. It's great for adults, kids, the whole family. The probiotic everyone's talking about. Just Thrive Probiotic and Antioxidant. Visit their website at thriveprobiotic.com. And Chelsea Green Publishing. Chelsea Green is recognized as a leading publisher of books about organic farming and homesteading, local food, restorative living, and diet-focused integrative health. Some new, recent, and best-selling titles from Chelsea Green include Dr. Tom Cowan's Vaccines, Autoimmunity, and the Changing Nature of Childhood Illness, Dr. Sarah Myhill's Sustainable Medicine, and Dr. Nasha Winter's The Metabolic Approach to Cancer. Learn more about these titles and all of the offerings at chelseagreen.com. And as a special bonus for Wise Traditions listeners, receive 30% off your order from Chelsea Green by using the discount code WAPF30 at checkout. And a quick reminder about our Wise Traditions Conference coming up in November in Baltimore. You'll get to hear from Kiran and many, many other experts. The Wise Traditions Conference isn't like other conferences where the speakers are up on the stage and kind of set apart. They field questions, they talk to you personally and connect with you. So come on out and join us for this one-of-a-kind event. And if you like this podcast, trust me, you are going to love the full meal of information, connection, and community that you'll find at the conference. And early birds who register for the full conference by June 15th can save $75 off the regular price. So sign up today at wisetraditions.org. If glyphosate is everywhere, what's the use of buying organic if we're not protecting ourselves from it?
And that's a really important question, because then people might say, well, I might as well eat the non-organic, cheaper stuff, right? The benefit of buying organic is this. Number one, we know that the soil in organic tends to be healthier, which means that the food tends to be healthier as well. So even though you are getting glyphosate exposure still, at least the nutrient value of the food is a little bit better. But here's the bigger picture on that. The bigger picture is that with organic, you cannot use glyphosate. So the more people push towards organic, the more economic pressure there will be for agricultural companies to get away from the use of glyphosate. Even though you're getting some exposure, when you use your wallet to choose organic, you are making a stance that I don't want this stuff on my food. And perhaps in the future, if enough people are buying organic, then the overall use of glyphosate would go way down in the country, and that gives us a chance to reset and clean up the environment.
The consumer demand may provoke change in what's happening, even if the regulations don't change.
Yeah, and I just don't see the regulations changing. I mean, we know without a doubt that cigarettes cause cancer, right? That was a 30, 40-year battle where good, sound science was proving that cigarette smoking causes cancer. Then, of course, industry would rebuke that with their own version of science. And then finally, it's been established that it does cause cancer, and you could still buy cigarettes, right? So imagine if vitamin C was shown to cause cancer next week. I mean, the FDA would pull it off the market in a flash. But the vitamin C industry is not nearly as big as some of these agro businesses. So I don't see the regulations changing anytime soon. The only way for us to ensure that we are reducing the amount of glyphosate being used in our environment, in the production of our food, is to make the choice of going organic and going cleaner foods, especially the non-GMO side, because then with the reduced use of glyphosate, it will cause economic distress where it becomes more favorable economically to use other more natural approaches.
Absolutely. So let's continue to talk about what we can do to take our health into our own hands and protect our bodies from glyphosate's damage.
Yeah, so as we know, what is happening when you're consuming glyphosate and getting significant exposure to it, there's actually two things happening. One is everybody experiences gut dysbiosis. So glyphosate comes in, it acts as like the worst kind of antibiotic you can have. It's selecting for the bad bacteria and basically eliminating good bacteria. We know that that type of dysbiosis leads to things like leaky gut, metabolic endotoxemia, which is a huge endotoxic response to eating food. It also leads to gluten sensitivity, dairy sensitivity, inflammation in the intestines, allergies, asthma, so on and so forth. So one of the things we need to focus on is how do we fix that dysbiosis? So we continuously need to send in things into the gut that can help fix the dysbiosis. Now, some of the things that we know will help with that are prebiotics, right? So certain types of prebiotics, what you want to do is find prebiotics that have oligosaccharide type of linkages in them, ones that have long degrees of polymerization, which means that they end up getting into the large bowel. So some of the ones are like XOS, a xylo-oligosaccharide. If you just Google XOS, you'll find companies that sell XOS. Some of the GOS prebiotics can be helpful as well, although if you have a dairy sensitivity, there will be some lactose in the GOS prebiotics. Then there are fructooligosaccharides, FOS. Fructooligosaccharides are also really important prebiotics that will help regrow the good bacteria, give them a competitive edge against the overgrown bad bacteria that is being selected for by the glyphosate. So adding in some of the prebiotics, that gives the good guys some fuel to have them fight back.
So you're mentioning XOS, GOS, FOS, and that's great. And I think our audience is going to look into all that. But are these prebiotics available in real food, Kiran?
They are. The problem is it's hard to get a measured dose of them within the real food itself, right? For example, with galacto-oligosaccharides, you'd have to be consuming a significant amount of whole milk in order to get enough of a dose. And for a lot of people, that can be very distressful on their gut. On the fructo-oligosaccharides, you can get them from fruits and vegetables. You'd have to be eating a significant amount to get the 1 or 2 grams that has been shown in clinical studies to be effective. Now, of course, you should be eating those foods anyway, right? You should be eating a bountiful choice of fruits and vegetables, and especially things like roots and tubers, cassava and yucca and plantains. All of those things contain a lot of resistant starches.
That's right.
They contain a lot of oligosaccharides that can actually feed the good bacteria. So I would do a combination of course, increasing the diversity of your diet, getting in as many of those natural, healthy foods in as possible, but then also supplementing to some degree with the prebiotics because you can control the dosing.
So we got the prebiotics to feed the good guys, as you said. What would be another step we could take?
So another step would be probiotics, of course. So we've been working on the spore-based probiotics. What I love about the spore-based probiotics is they were launched into the prescription market in the 1950s as competitive exclusion agents. So what does that mean? Well, that means that they have this unique capability of going into the gut, reading the microbial environment, and basically figuring out where the bad bacteria are, where the overgrown bacteria are, and then they sit next to them and they produce upwards of 25 different antibiotics in that little microenvironment to kill off the bad bacteria. So as the glyphosate's coming in and continuously increasing the growth of bad bacteria, you want to send in these gut policing bacteria to get in and undo that damage. And they physically can do that. We're actually going to be submitting a paper this year for publication where we completed a series of tests to show that when you add these bacillus endospores into your system, it dramatically increases the diversity of the rest of the microbiome. And it specifically helps grow certain types of bacteria that are really important to the overall function of the microbiome. Bacteria like Akkermansia muciniphila. This is a very, very important bacteria that tends to be very low in Western populations. But when you look at native tribes like the Hazara tribes or the hunter-gatherer tribes, they tend to have very high levels of Akkermansia. And high levels of Akkermansia are associated with having lean body mass, having no risk of metabolic syndrome, low gut inflammation, and all other wonderful wellness attributes. And Akkermansia controls so much of that. In fact, Akkermansia significantly reduces inflammation in the bowel and in the body. In one way that they do that is by increasing the expression of the endocannabinoid system. We've all heard about the benefits of CBD and hemp and all of these cannabinoids. The way those function is by binding to endocannabinoid receptors. This bacteria actually increases the expression of those receptors in the body. So it does all kinds of amazing things. The spores, when you add them into your system, increases the growth of that bacteria. Another group of bacteria that it increases, one called Faecalibacteria prausnitzii. Right now, when you look at all of the Crohn's and colitis research, there's a lot of work going on in figuring out how Faecalibacteria prausnitzii basically protects an individual from developing Crohn's or colitis. It's a bacteria associated with preventing inflammation in the mucus layer and inflammation in the intestinal lining. And again, it tends to be at very low levels in the Western population and very high levels in traditional populations that live off the land and still have that hunter-gatherer forager lifestyle. Now, as it turns out, when you add the spores in, Faecalibacteria prausnitzii goes up. Bifidobacteria levels go up. So these spores are going in and then reshifting the balance between good and bad bacteria.
And this is so exciting. The first part of our conversation was rather discouraging when I thought about the ubiquitousness of glyphosate and how damaging it is to us. And yet here there is a way to combat it with prebiotics, the probiotics, some of which are found in our food, some of which we might need to supplement if our diets are lacking in these nutrients. And you're so right. The way we eat today, even those of us who eat the best way possible, doesn't possibly cover all the nutrients and all the ways in which people were populating their gut bacteria back in the day.
And also, the foods themselves are just not as nutritious. just not as complex and just not as rich as they used to be when they were growing wild in really healthy soil with a lot of microbial activity, with the right mineralization, and of course the water that is being used on crops today have chlorine in them. And so it decimates the health of the soil versus during the course of human evolution, plants were watered naturally by clean rainwater. So that's where supplementation becomes important, is because our food system is just inadequate at the moment to really target and improve certain aspects of our gut and our overall health, especially in the light of huge negative influencers like glyphosate.
This is fantastic news about the prebiotics and probiotics, Kiran. Is there something else that we should do to protect our bodies?
There's a few other things that people can consider. Getting adequate amounts of vitamins seem to be an important aspect of allowing the regeneration of your intestinal cells, the mucosal cells, in response to the damage caused by these types of herbicides, especially like glyphosate. So some of the nutrients that seem to be especially important are vitamin C, vitamin A, magnesium, zinc, and of course vitamin D as well. Those particular micronutrients seem to play a significant role in allowing the intestinal lining and the cells that make up the intestinal lining and the mucosal system to regenerate themselves. So consuming foods that are very rich in these micronutrients will be a huge help to the repair system in the gut. The other thing is polyphenols. Polyphenols seem to be so significantly important to the health of the microbiome, the diversity of the microbiome, that it cannot be overstated. We're actually doing more and more research work on polyphenols right now. And of course, you can get a lot of polyphenols from natural products. Anything that has color to it will give you a certain amount of polyphenols. Coffee, good healthy coffee provides polyphenols. Of course, red wine gives you polyphenols, but grape skin and beets and things like that will provide you with polyphenols. So anytime you can consume higher amounts of polyphenols, that seems to have a significant benefit to undoing the types of damage that the herbicides like glyphosate do. Another aspect of it is when you get in these kind of herbicides and you create dysbiosis, you increase the oxidative stress in the gut and in the lining of the gut. And that oxidative stress will go a long way to damaging the lining of the gut. So improving the redox and the antioxidant side of things will help rebalance that as well. And there are numerous antioxidant-rich foods. A lot of the herbs, things like oregano, will have a significant amount of antioxidant property to them. So when I cook, for example, I often will use oregano in cooking or other similar herbs that have the antioxidant property to it, because you want to get in as much of that antioxidant property into the gut during the process of digestion.
Kiran, do you have an article that might enumerate some of these things that we're looking for in our diet, like the polyphenols and the foods with antioxidant properties and so on, so that I can point our listeners to that and put it in the show notes?
You know what? I don't have one right now, but how about we create one for you and your listeners?
Oh, that would be so wonderful.
Yes, we can do that in the next couple of weeks. That wouldn't be hard for us at all. We can highlight these. We can show examples of foods that would contain high levels of these particular nutrients, things that they should be looking at, and then strategies on, trying to reduce their exposure to the glyphosate. It is all around the environment, but there are things you can do to minimize your exposure, which we can highlight. And then, of course, fix the damage that it's doing on a regular basis.
Wow, that'd be fantastic. We'll make sure to put that in the show notes. So I just have a couple more questions for you as we begin to wrap up. First of all, do you know anything about how the Monsanto and Bayer merger is going to affect this whole realm of glyphosate and GMOs and such?
That's a very interesting question. Now, it's surprising to me that the Department of Justice has approved this merger. It's quite significant. Now, when I look at the overall mentality behind this kind of acquisition, why would Bayer want to buy Monsanto? Well, as it turns out, a lot of drug companies are looking at buying food companies. And there is a security in the drug companies for that, because foods are making people sick. And when people are sick, they need the drugs. So when you're a drug company and you own a food company or an agricultural company like Monsanto, you actually are producing the chemicals and the compounds and the products that create a need for your other products. It's a beautiful cyclical business, right? You can ensure that you are creating a need for the drugs by producing foods and chemicals and food-based chemicals that will eventually make people sick and need the product. So that, to me, is a really significant enlightenment in why a company like Bayer, who produces drugs to supposedly make people well, why would they buy an agribusiness company that sprays chemicals on foods like Monsanto? And that validates that cyclical nature of the business that they like. That's happening across the board. There's numerous drug companies buying food companies, and because the food is what will make people sick, and then the drug companies will profit well from selling the drugs that will supposedly cure you of that illness.
Wow.
So it's really mind-boggling when you think about it.
It is, and thank you for putting that in perspective to us. I hadn't heard it put quite that way, and that's really a paradigm shift for me. And I'm sure for the listener, too. So I want to ask now, as we wrap up, if the listener could do one thing, Kiran, to improve their health, what would you recommend that they do?
One thing that they can do to improve their health is be cognizant that everything they put into their system is either going to feed a good bacteria or feed a bad bacteria. And when we have an imbalance between good and bad bacteria, that's what sets the body off on a path to disease. So we have to be cognizant about what we're putting into our system. If it can kill bad bacteria within our system, we probably want to avoid it. I always tell people, whether you put something on your system or in your system, it should be something that you feel very comfortable is safe for your cells, for your good bacteria. So we need to be conscious that everything we do feeds bacteria within our system. So we need to make those decisions. If we can avoid foods with preservatives in it, if we can avoid water that has chlorine in it or fluoride in it, if we can avoid personal care products that are heavy in preservatives and toxic chemicals, all of those things disrupt our body's ecology. And if we can reduce the disruption to the ecology of the body, that will really propagate health and wellness.
Kiran, thank you so much. It is always enlightening and encouraging to speak with you. We appreciate your taking the time today.
It was my pleasure, and I'm happy to come back next time, and I look forward to it.
My guest today was Kiran Krishnan. If you can't get enough of Kiran, you can find him all over YouTube giving talks about the microbiome and our gut health. For the full show notes for today's episode, just go to our website, westinaprice.org, and look for the show notes for episode 133. And if you're enjoying this podcast, go ahead and subscribe through Apple Podcasts or through your favorite podcast app so you don't miss a thing. And thanks for helping us get the word out about Wise Traditions. Share episodes on social media, rate and review us on iTunes, share links with friends. Every little thing you do helps. And don't forget that you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Weston A. Price. And find us on Facebook, the Weston A. Price Foundation. You can also follow me personally at Holistic Hilda on Twitter, at Holistic_Hilda on Instagram. Next week, everybody, we will hear from Dr. Alvin Dannenberg. He was one of the experts featured on the recently released Human Longevity Project documentary. We have a wonderful conversation focused on anti-aging, and Alvin shares his own lifestyle hacks to live a long, productive life. Finally, a big thank you to my friends at Podcast Village for editing and moral support, and to the team of interns for the show. Cynthia Castro Cohen Enriquez, Joy de los Santos, Amy Marvin, Deirdre Beard, Diva Rizvi, Melanie Ahern, Mary Hine, and Olga de Villiers. And last but not least, please visit the podcast page on the westinaprice.org website. There's a super brief survey for podcast listeners there. We want to find out more about who you are so we can keep delivering the content that means the most to you. I promise you it'll only take a minute or so to fill out. Thanks for helping us out in advance. And keep listening, everybody.
Did you know that there are Weston A. Price Foundation chapters all over the U.S. and around the world? Chapter leaders help you find good food in your area, and some have meetings you can attend. Go to our website, westinaprice.org, and click on Find a Local Chapter to see if there is one near you. Wise Traditions is brought to you by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. The content of this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for medical advice.